Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider the question, given the near omnipotence of the totalitarian party, when exactly was Winston Smith exposed as a thought criminal? Of course, there are spoilers ahead, so if you haven't read this great work, then pause and read, or better yet listen to it on audio before you continue. By exposed, of course, this is not a reference to his and Julia's capture above Mr. Charrington's shop. Some have speculated as to the very moment Winston was caught, or rather uncovered, to the prying eyes of the Thought Police. Winston himself informs us that his own personal rebellion against the party had been a years-long affair. Quote, "The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was transfer to paper the interminable restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally for years." In chapter 4 of book 3, we do have a definitive answer. Quote, "From the moment when he was inside the Ministry of Love, and yes, even during those minutes when he and Julia had stood helpless while the iron voice from the telescreen told him what to do, he had grasped the frivolity, the shallowness of his attempt to set himself up against the power of the party. He knew now that for 7 years the Thought Police had watched him like a beetle under a magnifying glass. There had been no physical act, no word spoken aloud that they had not noticed, no train of thought that they had not been able to infer. Even the speck of whitish dust on the cover of his diary they had carefully replaced. They had played soundtracks to him, shown him photographs. Some of them were photographs of Julia and himself. Yes, even he could not fight against the party any longer. 7 years. The reference to the replacement of the speck of dust firmly covers the entire plot, another way of highlighting the apparent futility of Winston's defiance. The story, of course, begins with Winston's opening of his diary. Since no physical act had gone undetected, we can assume they knew of his visit to the Pearl prostitute before he confessed it in his diary, as well as his conversation with the old man in the Pearl pub, for instance, and perhaps every encounter between him and Julia, including their initial meeting, though Julia thought they were quite safe in their hiding spot. We have a time for the exposure, but just how did Winston give himself away? There are at least 2 ways this could have happened, though the following is merely speculation, though educated guessing, based on the lore of the book. Interestingly, there is a subtle connection made between Winston, Parsons, and the manner in which the latter was exposed. Parsons, Winston's stupid fellow tenant in Victory Mansions, had been denounced by his own daughter when she overheard him talking in his sleep, shouting, "Down with Big Brother." Winston himself seems to foreshadow this in Book 1, Chapter 6. Quote, "The most deadly danger of all was talking in your sleep. There was no way of guarding against that, so far as he could see." To further flesh out this connection, Winston himself, though not in sleep, but while deep in thought in Chapter 1, writes repeatedly and quite unconsciously, "Down with Big Brother." Of course, this is all just speculation, however this doesn't appear to be a meaningless connection. The exact same wording is used. Given we know from Winston's own careful nature to avoid the appearance of abnormality, could he have exposed himself through such an outburst in sleep years before? Another means by which exposure is possible is for a lapse in outward appearance. Winston is horrified to see an ordinary-looking man in Chapter 6, Book 1, passing by, his face twitching habitually, possibly unconsciously. Winston sadly notes how he was probably done for. With this way of exposure, we also have a connection with another character. In Book 2, Chapter 2, Julia and Winston talk during their first meeting in the clearing. Quote, "What could you see to attract you in a man like me? It was something in your face. I thought I'd take a chance. I'm good at spotting people who don't belong. As soon as I saw you, I knew you were against them." Given the excitement of the meeting, it's very easy to overlook this statement, but in truth, upon deeper reflection, This should have sounded alarm bells in Winston, and is perhaps a greater indication of how he exposed himself than the talking in his sleep theory. Julia, a young, fairly ordinary member of the outer party, at least in terms of intelligence, was able to spot that Winston did not belong. How much easier would it have been for a member of the Fort Police to pick him out? So Winston was always under the eye of the Fort Police from the beginning to the end of the plot. He was being watched for 7 years, though we cannot know exactly how he was initially exposed. Two feasible options in-universe ways of exposure are talking in your sleep and allowing your face to portray an inner turmoil or other indication of thought crime. While 1984 is certainly a story about just how far government control can be pushed, it's also easy to overlook the fact that it's a love story. Fans of the novel will know that Winston, our hero, has always harboured rebellion within his own secret thoughts and heart, but by the conclusion of the first part of the story, his own opposition to the party spreads to the next, interpersonal level. Winston surreptitiously receives a note from a dark-haired girl he has always both disliked and desired. On it are the words, "I love you." From this, a passionate and highly forbidden love affair ensues, a relationship that makes both Winston and Julia very happy. However, today we shall focus on the initial meeting and attraction of Winston and the theme of sex as rebellion in the novel. In particular, we shall look at the corrupt to the bones dialogue and the deeper meaning behind the exchange. This is not to chalk the whole relationship down to this one dimension of the couple, but simply to consider the initial attraction, at least on Winston's part. As we know, Winston secretly despises the party and Big Brother, and keeps a diary from the beginning of the story to recount his frequent thoughts on his life and the totalitarian society he suffers through every day. On the surface, he laments that everyone seemingly buys into the party line. Everyone, at least superficially, reveres Big Brother, fully accepts the principles of Ingsoc, and totally embraces the lifestyle enforced by the Fort Police and all the other mechanisms of oppression in Oceania. Though it's possible there are some like Winston, people who reject Big Brother and the rest of it, Winston can never be sure of this, at least at that stage. Even his suspicions about the unorthodoxy of O'Brien are very tenuous at best, based on a quick flash of the eyes at the 2 minutes hate. Funnily enough, given how events ultimately pan out, Winston feels the reverse about Julia, the dark-haired girl. Though he is physically attracted to her, he is also repelled by her, and most young women like her. Winston explains that it's down to their typical fanaticism, such women being among the most bigoted members of the party. Quote, "swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies and nosers out of unorthodoxy." Ironically, Julia does prove excellent at nosing out Winston's own unorthodoxy, later explaining that it was something in his face that initially attracted her to him. From his facial expression, she concluded he was against the party. For Winston earlier on though, Julia felt particularly dangerous, with him interpreting her occasional staring at and close proximity to him as hostile acts. To be fair to Winston, his mistaken interpretations here were based on what he generally knew about the women of the party. Quote, "The women of the party were all alike. Chastity was as deep ingrained in them as party loyalty. By careful early conditioning, by games and cold water, by the rubbish that was dinned into them at school, and in the spies and in the youth league, by lectures, parades, songs, slogans, and martial music, the natural feeling had been driven out of them. His reason told him that there must be exceptions, but his heart did not believe it. They were all impregnable, as the party intended that they should be, and what he wanted, more even than to be loved, was to break down that wall of virtue, even if it were only once in his whole life. The sexual act, successfully performed, was rebellion. Desire was thought crime." A long quote, but vital to understand Winston's later memorable words and attraction to Julia. Winston's attraction and desire to sleep with Julia is thus closely tied with his own desire to oppose the party. Sex is very much a political act, and an act of opposition at that. Julia herself explains why this is so later on. Quote, "When you make love, you're using up energy, and afterwards you feel happy and don't give a damn for anything. They can't bear you to feel like that. They want you to be bursting with energy all the time. All this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. If you're happy inside yourself, why should you get excited about Big Brother and the 3-year plans and the 2 minutes hate and all the rest of their bloody rot?" This is the source of the party's ban on the sex act between party members outside of the joyless sex used within marriage to sire children. In contrast to his relationship with Julia, Winston's relationship with his wife was, unfortunately for him, typically orthodox. Catherine would stiffen, and while the act itself was performed, Winston felt the odd sensation that his wife was both submitting whilst simultaneously resisting, no enjoyment on her part. Catherine's attitude to sex is, for the party, the only legitimate one. A couple's duty to the party in begetting offspring is the aim of sex and marriage. Any other variation is termed sex crime and, by definition, rebellion. Prior to Julia, Winston assumed all women were like his estranged wife. When considering all of the aforementioned, we can better understand the dialogue of Winston and Julia's initial meeting. In the clearing, the two have the following exchange. "Have you done this before?" "Of course, hundreds of times. Well, scores of times anyway. With party members?" "Yes, always with party members." "With members of the inner party?" "Not with those swine, no. But there's plenty that would if they got half a chance. They're not so holy as they make out." His heart leapt. Scores of times she had done it. He wished it had been hundreds, thousands. Anything that hinted at corruption always filled him with a wild hope. Who knew, perhaps the party was rotten under the surface, its cult of strenuousness and self-denial, simply a sham concealing iniquity. If he could have infected the whole lot of them with leprosy or syphilis, how gladly he would have done so. Anything to rot, to weaken, to undermine. He pulled her down so that they were kneeling face to face. "Listen, the more men you've had, the more I love you. Do you understand that?" "Yes, perfectly." "I hate purity. I hate goodness. I don't want any virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone to be corrupt to the bones." "Well then, I ought to suit you, dear. I'm corrupt to the bones." "You like doing this. I don't mean simply me. I mean the thing in itself." "I adore it." Interestingly, before this exchange, Julia is ready to make love, but Winston is not. Once they have this exchange, however, Winston has no problem. We can see then that Winston's sexual desire is inextricably linked to and sparked by the fact of the act as forbidden and rebellious in itself. In an earlier thought, and then later in reality before they actually make love, Winston admires Julia's own casting aside of her red sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League and symbol of the party's grip over the sexual act. Indeed, in the imagined version, no overt sexual desire was provoked, but simply admiration of the act in itself that could so easily defy the power of the party. Without the context we have been exploring, Winston's comment about whether Julia had had affairs with members of the inner party might have seemed an inquiry in the negative. Had she been sleeping with the enemy, so to speak? However, the question answered in the affirmative would likely have increased Winston's pleasure. Even the core of the party itself would have been compromised. Winston was likely somewhat satisfied with Julia's assurance that many would sleep with her if offered the opportunity. So there we have it, the context behind the famous exchange between Winston and Julia on their first meeting. sex as rebellion in 1984. What do you think? Are there any other themes you would like to explore? Does Big Brother exist? Of course he exists. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. Does he exist in the same way as I exist? You do not exist, said O'Brien. In Orwell's dystopian world of 1984, death is not the only ultimate indignity heaped upon those unfortunate enough to cross the thought police. For the party, death of their enemies is not enough, and any erroneous thought and mind must be fixed, and love for Big Brother elicited before the thought criminal is vaporized from history. This was the implication behind O'Brien's superficially nonsensical retort in the depths of the Ministry of Love. Winston himself is now an unperson, not only effectively dead, but soon to be lifted clean out of history itself. Since the party controls all records and through doublethink and Crime Stop, all the minds of party members, no trace of Winston will, in theory, be left. However, is this actually so? When questioning this, we're not considering whether every mind is sufficiently under control to abolish Winston from their memories. No, this may be a consideration for another talk. Today we settle if Winston was indeed vaporized in the book, and there is actually a definitive answer. Another key distinction to make here is not if Winston was eventually killed by the party, which is a separate issue. Death does not necessarily entail vaporization, as we shall see. Even Winston's death, something he secretly longs for by the end of the book, is not known by the final words of the book. Again, another interesting thing to consider in another talk. For an answer to our question today, we must move beyond the main body of the novel itself and into the appendix. This additional part of the book comes after the end of the main plot itself, but is in fact loosely tied to the world of the plot. The appendix appears to be a simple explanation of the world's language newspeak. However, it is also written within the context of the same world and from a future perspective. That it is written from some future where oldspeak still exists and newspeak is a historical curiosity has several implications. Today we look at a particular quote from the appendix. For context, the language was divided into 3 vocabularies, and this extract deals with the so-called B vocabulary, which covers political concepts and things as we shall see. Quote, "So far as it can be contrived, everything that had or might have political significance of any kind was fitted into the B vocabulary. The name of every organisation or body of people or doctrine or country or institution or public building was invariably cut down into the familiar shape, that is, a single easily pronounced word with the smallest number of syllables that would preserve the original derivation. In the Ministry of Truth, for example, the records department in which Winston Smith worked was called RecDep. The fiction department was called FicDep. The teleprograms department was called TeleDep, and so on. The line is almost throwaway, an example pulled up to illustrate a rather dry point about the language. However, the reference to Winston directly has huge significance. With his mention, we can assume that not only is newspeak an aspect of the past, recalled here by the writer, but the memory of Winston himself also endured into this future period, a future time where Big Brother, the Thought Police and Ingsoc are no more. We know this as no such reminiscence of the language of newspeak would have been permitted in Winston's own time. Though we cannot be sure if Winston was finally shot by the party after his full submission at the novel's conclusion, we now know that at least the memory of Winston in some form endured to a time after the horror of his own time. This truth provides some consolation for us as readers and viewers that Winston in some small way did defeat the party. O'Brien himself explains how the party finds it intolerable to allow any who had gone astray to remain a memory in a brain or a note in a record. Winston Smith, always obsessed with the abolished past of his own time and finally condemned to the apparent oblivion that he himself condemned many others to through his own work, ironically remained a person in history, not an unperson. So there we have it, why Winston Smith was not vaporized. At the heart of 1984 lies Winston Smith, Orwell's everyman character, through which we experience the extremes of totalitarianism. Winston lives a dreary life of lies and quiet suffering, forced to live the strict, laborious life of an outer party member. His waking hours are dictated almost to the minute by the party, from his work updating public records at the Ministry of Truth, to his meals and daily exercise, even down to his social time, his attendances at the community centre, carefully noted. It's very easy to empathise with Winston on this level alone. However, as with many things in 1984, Winston's own tragic character has another more ominous layer to explore. Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider Winston's own moral character and loss of humanity in 1984. Was Winston ultimately much better than the party he so despised? Was Winston unwillingly dehumanized by the very party he so hated? At a meta level, as with any hero in any story, Winston as our protagonist has his own goals. In the context of his world and predicament, even these are bleak and pathetic when set against the power of the party. Earlier on in the novel, Winston simply longs to touch the lost past that he himself participates in abolishing. To this end, he notes down his own account of things, furtively written to some vague future, before in his thoughts he settles on the imagined friend, O'Brien, as his audience. He questions the old pro in the pub for any scraps of recalled knowledge from the forbidden past, then encounters Charrington, seemingly a far better source of ties to the past. He obtains the paperweight and extracts the old rhyme from the old man's memory. Later, following the initiation of his affair with Julia, he has the additional raw goal of survival. He becomes more averse to taking unnecessary risks, such as venturing into rural areas, and acts like writing the diary. Yet perhaps his most important goal, and the one that relates most potently, is his aim to retain his humanity. Winston wrestles with this issue of both his and the party's inhumanity throughout the novel. His own actions and thoughts consistently demonstrate his losing of this battle, a fact that both troubles and horrifies him. Winston explains his own desire of relearning a humanity lost to him and party members in the following quote, "The proles had stayed human. They had not become hardened inside. They had held on to the primitive emotions which he himself had had to relearn by conscious effort." And in thinking this, he remembered, without apparent relevance, how a few weeks ago he had seen a severed hand lying on the pavement and had kicked it into the gutter as though it had been a cabbage stalk. Linked to this acquired reverence for the humanity of the proles is the tragic story of Winston's mother and sister. Though he does not recall exactly how, Winston knows they both died in some way as a sacrifice for him. Winston similarly notes how his mother's love for him was lost to him and his own class of peers, her private emotions and loyalties, something that could not occur in his own time. Linked to this too is the story he relates right at the beginning of the book. In Part 1, Chapter 1, we have a subtle sign of Winston's moral numbness in his recollection of his time at the flicks. He writes about the scene of the giant fat man riddled with bullets at sea, and then the vivid scene of a mother cradling her terrified son before they and the group they are in are blown to bits. He describes in gory detail how a child's arm was followed up into the air and accompanied by raucous applause from the party seats. Presumably Winston joined in this and, interestingly, does not specifically cite his own particular disgust at the act itself, but instead notes a prole woman's reaction to the scene. The prole woman pipes up shouting, "It ain't right, not in front of the kids it ain't," which Winston dismisses as a typical prole reaction. Winston's later dream of his mother and sister drowning in a deep chasm underwater quite clearly subconsciously links his mother and sister to the murdered Jewish mother and son in his diary entry. Winston also muses how his mother was of the older era, where such unconditional love and bonds between mother and children were were natural, instinctive, and free. Winston himself feels guilt and a certain disconnection between both the proles in general and his mother. Both felt emotions and had bonds he simply lacked. Proles remained in families loyal to each other without having to know why they were. Winston's mother loved him without needing to understand why. By the time of the opening of the novel, Winston is undoubtedly a creature of his own warped society. He lives alone and under the total surveillance of the party. The one close link he did have was with a brainwashed and passionless wife named Catherine, who tolerated him solely for the purposes of children, themselves to be had for service to the party. Winston has no real friends, just distant and untrustworthy party comrades. His work, too, is lonely and antisocial, the man couched day after day in a cubicle, continually changing public records to accord with the party truth. He barely knows more than a few colleagues by name, and has no close relationships with any of them. Even his so-called friend, Syme, he admits has a quasi-hostile bond with him. They perhaps enjoy each other's company, yet Winston fully understands that if Syme for a moment gauged his own unorthodox thoughts and secret opinions, that he would unquestionably turn him in to the thought police. Given this is the sad reality of Winston Smith, it's little wonder he exists largely dehumanized, though for a time he sees a resurgence of emotion and love with his brief relationship with Julia. The key scene demonstrating this state of being is in the meeting scene between Winston, Julia, and O'Brien. Here, Winston believes he is being initiated into the shadowy brotherhood by O'Brien, and the latter extracts with little difficulty a series of dark pledges from him. Quote, O'Brien began asking his questions in a low, expressionless voice, as though this were a routine, a sort of catechism, most of whose answers were known to him already. You are prepared to give your lives. Yes. You are prepared to commit murder. Yes. To commit acts of sabotage which may cause the death of hundreds of innocent people. Yes. To betray your country to foreign powers. Yes. You are prepared to cheat, to forge, to blackmail, to corrupt the minds of children, to distribute habit-forming drugs, to encourage prostitution, to disseminate venereal diseases, to do anything which is likely to cause demoralization and weaken the power of the party. Yes. If, for example, it would somehow serve our interests to throw sulfuric acid in a child's face, are you prepared to do that? Yes. In addition, Winston is willing to permanently change his own identity and commit suicide when ordered to. The one telling exception to all this is any permanent separation between he and Julia, which Winston, after Julia's own protest, he refuses to accept. Later on, after Winston's capture, during his time with O'Brien, the latter asks if Winston feels morally superior to him and the party, to which Winston answers he does. By replaying the audio of the meeting scene, O'Brien highlights Winston's own hypocrisy in agreeing to potentially commit acts just as bad as the party. There's no doubt that this realization of his own inhumanity in common with O'Brien and the party, despite his earlier aims of remaining human, even in the face of party torture, did serve to break down Winston's spirit further during this scene. Sadly, Winston had already lost his battle to stay human to a large extent, long before then. Winston's years of living under party rule and his deep hatred of it had, despite himself, led him to become a grim reflection of the very people he most hated. By the novel's conclusion, of course, this hatred had been largely mollified and forged into love for both Big Brother and the party. By this point, the competing love and loyalty he had had for Julia had been burnt out of him. Even fond memories of his mother are dismissed as false memories by what's left of Winston in the Chestnut Tree Cafe. In his curing process with O'Brien, the latter had stated, quote, "Never again will you be capable of ordinary human feeling. Everything will be dead inside you. Never again will you be capable of love or friendship or joy of living or laughter or curiosity or courage or integrity. You will be hollow, we shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves. Unfortunately, as Winston ominously mused at the beginning of his ordeal, there are no heroes here. Winston has been utterly defeated, both physically and psychologically, by the all-powerful party, a grim warning from Orwell just how dark a fate could await anyone in such a totalitarian world. So that was some thoughts on Winston's tragic loss of his humanity. What do you think? Did some small part of Winston remain alive, deep down, even after his release from the Ministry of Love? Was the party wholly successful in warping Smith? Greetings comrades, and welcome to another episode of 1984 Lore. Today we take a look at another minor character of the novel, and one overlooked in the major adaptations of the book. I am of course referring to Catherine Smith, estranged wife of Winston, the main character of 1984. Catherine Smith is described by Winston as, quote, a tall, fair-haired girl, very straight with splendid movements. She had a bold, aquiline face, a face that one may have called noble until one discovered that there was nearly as possible nothing behind it. Very early in her married life, he had decided that she had, without exception, the most stupid, vulgar, empty mind that he had ever encountered. She had no thought in her head that was not a slogan, and there was no imbecility, absolutely none, that she was not capable of swallowing if the party handed it out to her. The human soundtrack, he nicknamed her in his own mind. From this rather less than flattering description, you may be wondering how the two married in the first place, if there was such a dislike on his part. The party's philosophy on marriage and children has been covered in detail in another video on this channel. However, in general terms, it's actually deliberate policy for the party to couple incompatible, even hostile individuals in marriage, the better to offset the development of any love or loyalty outside of love and loyalty for the party and Big Brother. Winston, in the same part of the book, goes on to describe his painful and jarring sex life with Catherine, which indicates the feeling of dislike was mutual, or at the very least that there was no attraction on Catherine's part. Catherine, as with very likely the majority of party girls, had been conditioned to be fearful and disgusted by the sexual act, so that by the time she and Winston were married, she did her duty by submitting to her husband, while clearly demonstrating in her rigidity and attitude that she hated doing so. Winston describes sex with his wife as feeling as if she was simultaneously pulling him to her, while also pushing him away, her body stiff and statuesque. Understandably, Winston found this very embarrassing and desired to remain celibate within the marriage. However, Catherine, good party girl she was, and despite her disgust, insisted that they keep trying for a child. As was drilled into her from childhood, this was, she said, their duty to the party. According to Winston, the couple separated around 1973. However, before this, the two had participated in a hike, and on that occasion, Winston later recalls with Julia that he had had a moment of desperate weakness in which he seriously considered murdering his wife to escape the marriage. 3 or 4 months into their 15-month or so marriage, the two had been split from their group. Winston, curiously minded as he is, noticed that some flowers had bloomed in 2 different colours from the same roots. This on the side of a cliff at the edge of a chalk quarry. Upon his insistence, Catherine pulled herself away from trying to rejoin the group and leant over to look at what Winston was looking at. It was at this moment that the thought occurred to him. He had steadied her with a hand on her waist. They were quite alone. The probability of any microphone, let alone a telescreen or camera, was quite low. Winston's hand could very easily have left Catherine's waist with a small shove, the act leaving her body lifeless and broken at the bottom of the chasm. For all anybody could tell, she could have wandered off alone, taken a tumble. Winston would have been free. Of course, the thought had not translated into action. At least to Winston's knowledge, Catherine remained alive, and in any case the murder was unnecessary, given the two separated around 15 months into their marriage. This is all according to Winston's memory. However, another interesting twist to this whole story is the later accusation during his interrogation that Winston did, in fact, murder his wife. Of course, given this is the party, we must take such a charge with a mountain of salt. However, assuming Catherine was the model party woman Winston described, this actually opens up an interesting issue. There seems to be a contradiction of sorts between what we know about Catherine's character and the limits of such accusations. Assuming that Catherine is alive during Winston's interrogation, it's surely somewhat odd, even for the party to make such a claim and later publicly charge Winston with this, if she is quite clearly and evidently alive and walking about, still a name on public records and perhaps very active in party life. This leads me to the thought that perhaps Catherine was dead by this point, which in turn opens up some interesting possibilities. Firstly, is Winston lying? The evidence here is pretty weak, but it's fun to speculate. Winston did admit to Julia in their first meeting that he had seriously considered smashing her head in with a cobblestone when she had spied him outside of Charrington's shop. We know this was a genuine, if fleeting, thought, as we followed Winston's panicked thoughts on this at the time. Winston also seems to have violent, if suppressed, tendencies. He shows little to no emotion when describing the horrific deaths of people that he witnessed during his trip to the Flicks, an episode he writes about in his diary in Chapter 1. He also coldly kicks aside a severed hand following a rocket bomb attack, only later considering the inhumanity of this act. He also has violent thoughts and hallucinations. During the 2 minutes hate, he imagines flogging and raping Julia, then cutting her throat at the moment of climax. In addition, he imagines driving a pickaxe into the face of a man called Wilshire, as he had delayed his first conversation with Julia by inviting him to his table in the canteen. Finally, O'Brien quite easily extracts a series of pledges from him in their meeting at his home, which includes the obligation to commit sabotage and murder, even to throw sulfuric acid into a child's face, among other things. This is quite a lot of evidence that Winston seems to have violent tendencies, but is this enough to prove he had, in fact, murdered his wife? Well, probably not. The most that one could say is that he certainly had the motive, as aforementioned, and perhaps had the proclivity. However, the latter assertion is perhaps going too far, as Winston also demonstrates time and again an aversion, if anything, to physical acts, including violence. Winston draws back from shoving his wife, he shrinks away from pursuing Julia, and even hates to use his hands generally. One more pushback in the opposite direction could be that, of course, Winston, in recalling the incident with Julia, would likely not really tell her that he'd murdered his wife, even if he had. It's true Julia boldly stated she would have, but it seems probable that if Winston really had killed his wife and genuinely confessed this, that Julia may have naturally reacted differently. Realising your secret boyfriend murdered his wife may put somewhat of a damper on the whole business. Winston did have a motive not to relate the true version of events, although what's more likely by far is that he really didn't kill his wife, which actually leads us to another dark possibility. If we stick to our initial theory that even the Thought Police couldn't feasibly pin Catherine's death on him, if she was in fact alive, was she dead because she herself had strayed into heresy? Given what little we know about her character, this seems almost as unlikely as Winston actually murdering her. However, this does seem feasible, assuming the whole charge of Catherine's murder isn't simply a bald-faced lie, and the Thought Police simply don't care how it looks. Pushing back on this, we do know that the party are capable of such brazen falsehoods, and likely rely on general fear and doublethink to offset them. Though Radford's adaptation of the novel does show Winston publicly confessing, there's nothing in the novel to suggest he was important enough for his charges to be a matter for the public record. On the contrary, O'Brien assures Winston he will be vaporized, that is, lifted clean from the stream of history. The only sliver of evidence to suggest this was not so is through implication of the contrary in the appendix. Since Winston is mentioned by name, and the section is written as if describing events and Oceania in the past, we can assume some memory of Winston remains, which further implies his fate was, to some degree, a matter of public record. Even if so, the example of Jones, Aronson and Rutherford shows how the party doesn't care if such blatant contradictions are public. Winston had held for a brief few seconds a photograph of the trio of condemned men that had proved they were in New York at an exact date when they were supposed to be betraying military secrets to Eurasian officials in Siberia. The point here is that if such a photograph was missed or simply allowed to exist for these important men, then a live Catherine, decidedly unimportant to the public gaze, was infinitely more admissible, given the process of doublethink. Yet, as it's fun to speculate, what if Catherine was dead and not at Winston's hands? If Catherine herself had somehow, to use Winston's phrasing, been awakened, was she then vaporized before the events of the novel? Of course, this is all just theory, but hopefully fun to think about, and based on the little we know. To me at least, this seems the least likely of the two darker scenarios, given her character. More than likely, Catherine lives in her own apartment or in a hostel with other women, still a model party member, and perhaps through the process of doublethink, has no memories of her husband. "You are afraid," said O'Brien, watching his face, "that in another moment something is going to break. Your especial fear is that it will be your backbone. You have a vivid mental picture of the vertebrae snapping apart and the spinal fluid dripping out of them. That is what you are thinking, is it not, Winston?" One particularly unnerving horror among many that Winston encounters during his time with O'Brien in the Ministry of Love is his uncanny ability to know exactly what he is thinking. Indeed, this skill seemingly verges on the supernatural. However, is there a more worldly explanation for how O'Brien can seemingly read Winston's mind? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider this very question. O'Brien, in fact, appears to accurately read Winston's mind several times during the interrogation. The first instance considered was from the opening quote. The second example was during their conversation about the nature of the past. On that occasion, when asked if he believes that the past has real existence, Winston struggles to find an answer in which he genuinely believes. This provokes a faint smile in O'Brien. O'Brien seems to instantly understand his struggle, commenting that Winston is no metaphysician. This particular example could feasibly be explained by hesitance alone, perhaps expressed in his face, so may not be a particularly potent one. However, it's still quite impressive nonetheless. A later example is when Winston inwardly wonders why, if he is to be destroyed completely, that is, vaporized or swept clean out of all memories and records, why was the party bothering to torture him? Without a word uttered from Winston, O'Brien instantly comprehends the question in his mind. His eyes narrowed in understanding, and he said, quote, "You are thinking that since we intend to destroy you utterly, so that nothing that you can say or do can make the smallest difference, in that case, why do we go to the trouble of interrogating you first? That is what you were thinking, was it not?" "Yes," said Winston. Winston, of course, possesses a mind riddled with heretical thoughts, and the party, according to O'Brien, finds it intolerable for even one erroneous thought to exist, which is why Winston must be cleansed or cured before his eventual vaporization. A final and perhaps the most ominous example we'll consider today is in the closing words of the chapter. Winston lay silent, his breast rose and fell a little faster. He had still not asked the question that had come into his mind the first. He had got to ask it, and yet it was as though his tongue would not utter it. There was a trace of amusement in O'Brien's face. Even his spectacles seemed to wear an ironical gleam. He knows, thought Winston suddenly. He knows what I'm about to ask. At the thought, the words burst out of him. What is in room 101? The expression on O'Brien's face did not change. He answered dryly, You know what is in room 101, Winston. Everyone knows what is in room 101. So how can this be? How can O'Brien so accurately know in real time, or close to it, what Winston is thinking? I have two explanations based on the lore that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first possibility is scientific. Though the 1984 universe is a world of lies, we must still take what we do have, in this instance Goldstein's book, which does provide an answer here. The book is a fabrication of the Thought Police, partially written by O'Brien himself. However, he does admit to Winston that it's true as description. In the book, it's explained that the party has two broad concerns. Firstly, how to kill several 100 million people at once and without the possibility of retaliation. Secondly, to discover against his will what another man is thinking. On the latter, the book details how party scientists are either dedicated to branches of knowledge conducive to the former goal or the latter one of determining a man's thoughts against his will. On the latter, the book further details how party scientists are dedicated to branches of knowledge conducive to the latter goal of determining a man's thoughts against his will. To the latter end, scientists study the intricate meanings of facial expressions, gestures, and tones of voice, while also using truth-inducing drugs, hypnosis, shock therapy, and torture. Though this description is quite vague, it does at least provide some context as to how Winston's interrogators can accurately follow his emotions and train of thought. I would personally suggest heavy use of drugs and some kind of monitoring system is used to predict in real time Winston's thoughts. We do see O'Brien and the unnamed assistant use a device to force Winston's memory to conform to the party truth about the war and on how many fingers O'Brien held up. 2 pads are attached to his temples, though their method on mind reading must be different, given O'Brien demonstrates this without such a device. I think given the technology of Orwell's time, in conjunction with the logical extreme in which the party can and does exert its control, even over an individual's thoughts, Orwell has to be vague about the particular method here of mind reading, while at the same time demonstrating this particular power that the party has. Another take on all this, which is not necessarily mutually exclusive to the other, is that Winston is O'Brien's project, and hence intimately known by him. The two are also very similar, both acknowledging they have similar minds. Winston admits in the book that O'Brien is someone he can relate to, or at least talk to, that even if he is an enemy, that O'Brien would still understand him. O'Brien too feels a mutual connection with Winston, even saying that Winston's mind appeals to him, even that his mind resembles his own, though Winston happens to be insane. Winston at one point even verges on agreement with this sentiment, thinking that O'Brien's mind was so much bigger than his, that his mind contained Winston's, and so it must be he that is indeed mad. Aside from this close bond, O'Brien and the Thought Police were also helpfully assisted by Winston's not-so-secret diary too, in which much of his thoughts, attitudes and habits would have been made known to them to further get an idea about his personality and even his probable thinking. It's not exaggerating to suggest that few, if anyone, knows Winston as well as O'Brien by the time of his arrest. O'Brien even states he has watched over him for 7 years. Every aspect of Winston's life was jealously scrutinised, to the point where O'Brien can accurately anticipate his thoughts and answers. Of course, this may be stretching things somewhat, given O'Brien's ability to read Winston's mind seems a step closer to perfect than even this, which still leaves open the possibility of being wrong about a particular point, which O'Brien never is. I think the second explanation alone is not enough to account for the accuracy of O'Brien's mind reading. We see Winston injected with drugs and mentally manipulated at least once, as aforementioned, when he was assisted to remember who Oceania was at war with, and that the fingers O'Brien held up were 5 and not 4. With a mixture of drugs, mental manipulation, and the real-time reading of facial and other physical indicators, it seems highly likely that O'Brien has instant access to real-time information on Winston's thoughts. A final meta-explanation, of course, simply could be an Orwellian appeal to a suspension of belief in this regard. When the novel was written in the late 1940s, it would have been difficult to imagine any such manner of reading a man's thoughts in real time. But since Orwell wanted to write about the most extreme case of totalitarianism, total party control of the human mind and thoughts, as well as a man's physical body, would be the logical end of any such regime, which is what Orwell presents here. Given what we know from the lore then, our explanation is a mix of heavy and prolonged surveillance for years, as well as use of mind-altering drugs, as well as psychological conditioning, shock therapy, torture, and hypnosis. The exact method as to how O'Brien reads Winston's thoughts is not known, but Goldstein's book makes it clear this ability to read the minds of thought criminals was one of 2 of the party's highest goals, and, it seems, in the case of Winston at least, they succeeded. So that was how O'Brien could read the thoughts of Winston during his interrogation. What do you think? Was there some other way O'Brien knew what Winston was thinking? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we delve more into the symbolic realm of the novel, specifically the coral paperweight Winston purchases from Charrington's shop. The significance of this object cannot be understated. Winston first sets eyes on it in Chapter 8 of Part 1. Quote, "What appealed to him about it was not so much its beauty as the air it seemed to possess of belonging to an age quite different from the present one. The soft, rain-watery glass was not like any other glass that he had ever seen. The thing was doubly attractive because of its apparent uselessness, though he could guess that it must once have been intended as a paperweight. For Winston, it represents a physical tie to the past he so longs to connect to. Later on too, Julia asks what its function is, to which Winston answers it has no real use, but that is exactly what he likes about it. In his totalitarian world, where every act and every individual has its place to service the state, this small and forgotten piece of history becomes even more precious to Winston. It's alien to the world, both old and apparently useless, yet in these qualities lies its very appeal. So we get why Winston is attracted to its uselessness, but why is the paperweight's tie to the forbidden past important for Winston particularly? As Winston himself perfectly understands, given his age and job within the Ministry of Truth's records department, the party effectively controls the present by controlling the past. All records in all the different mediums are, in theory, altered to conform to what the party maintains is the real truth. Such a gargantuan undertaking even has a prominent example in the latter point of Part 2 of the novel, when the war shifts from Eurasia to East Asia. Winston notes that such a change of enemy and ally happens periodically, but that no switch is ever openly acknowledged. Due to this shift in enemy and ally, Winston and all his colleagues in the Ministry of Truth are obliged to work 18 hours a day for around a week, just to change all references to the war from Eurasia to East Asia. Winston then has an intimate stake in this continuous erasure and replacement of the past. In addition, Winston's age, around 39 for most of the novel, means he is of a generation who does possess clear memories of life before the party. However, they are often hazy and he can never be certain of them. Something like the paperweight and also the picture of St. Clement's Dane in the room do have a solid connection outside of both party dogma and Winston's own unreliable memory. Aside from its apparent existence as an objective tie to the past, for Winston the paperweight symbolises his own life, separate and free from the party. Quote, "The inexhaustibly interesting thing was not the fragment of coral, but the interior of the glass itself. There was such a depth of it, and yet it was almost as transparent as air. It was as though the surface of the glass had been the arc of the sky, enclosing a tiny world with its atmosphere complete. He had the feeling that he could get inside it, and that in fact he was inside it, along with the mahogany bed and the gate-leg table and the clock and the steel engraving and the paperweight itself. The paperweight was the room he was in, and the coral was Julia's life and his own, fixed in a sort of eternity at the heart of the crystal. This analogy becomes important later on when the lovers are finally caught. The particular description of the contents of the room being enclosed in the glass is important, given the room has become the arena, so to speak, of Winston's own secret life outside of the party's control. Though Winston knows deep down, and even voices at times, that he and Julia's time is limited, he may also at times feel like his life with Julia away from the party can somehow be continuous and contained if it remains confined to the room. Julia is certainly more optimistic on this score, and even Winston fantasizes with her sometimes of perhaps escaping, the two living as proles and developing proletarian accents while working in a factory. However, he quickly sees this as the fantasy that it is. The paperweight's glass thus becomes a symbol of this desperate hope, Winston completing the metaphor by equating his life with the coral itself. Of course, Winston and Julia's hope is misplaced. Indeed, there is little that is not part of a cruel deception, even down to the beloved paperweight itself. When caught, the paperweight's destruction is a significant moment, as the breaking of the glass and the exposure of the coral mirrors the breaking of and exposure of Winston and Julia's affair and secret life. I don't think the targeting and breaking of the paperweight in particular was arbitrary too. In addition to Orwell using it as a symbol of Winston's defiance, its breaking by the police who arrest Winston is likely a revealing little detail that ties in with the character and motivations of the party. Within the room, Winston, it is later revealed, was watched constantly, and his attachment to the object would have been obvious from the time of its purchase. It's quite probable too that O'Brien and the party had also divined Winston's own inner feelings and thoughts towards it. This is another interesting subject, the party's grasp on Winston's thoughts, particularly how O'Brien can apparently read Winston's mind, and there is a dedicated video on this subject on the channel. Assuming the reasoning behind Winston's attachment to it was understood, the paperweight's destruction may have been a deliberate act on the part of the Fort Police. Quote, "There was another crash. Someone had picked up the glass paperweight from the table and smashed it to pieces on the hearthstone. The fragment of coral, a tiny crinkle of pink like a sugar rosebud from a cake, rolled off across the mat. How small, thought Winston. How small it always was. O'Brien and Charrington likely ordered the smashing of it, given they understood it was a symbol of defiance and hope. With its smashing, Winston's own delusion of a continuous secret life in defiance of the party is definitively smashed too. It's interesting to consider, as this would subtly begin Winston's own transformation to good party member even before he sees the inside of the Ministry of Love. Like the fragment of coral itself, Winston's own life and limited defiance always had been small and ultimately powerless in the larger context of the power of the party. In addition, Winston must have understood with the revealing of Charrington and the later revelation of the true extent of the Fort Police's surveillance that even his beloved paperweight itself had in actuality never been outside of history or apart from party control. In many ways, like himself, the paperweight had always been a construction of the party itself. One question that sometimes puzzles readers of 1984 is why, if the party had really been aware of Winston's heresy for 7 years, they took so long to arrest and cure him. This is a fair question, which I believe does have a decent answer based on what we know about the party's philosophy on power within the novel. Welcome to 1984 Lore, the channel for all things 1984. So to begin with, and for those who may not know, O'Brien later claimed that Winston had been exposed for at least 7 years before he was actually arrested. In Part 3, Chapter 4, Winston reveals that the Fort Police had been intimately monitoring him for that amount of time. They had picked up on every dodgy word, every facial expression, and had even carefully replaced a speck of whitish dust that Winston had previously placed on the cover of his secret diary to indicate if it had been discovered. They replayed soundtracks to him and showed him photographs too. This point then is unarguable. However, it does beg the question, if the Fort Police had been aware of Winston for so long, why was he not arrested much sooner? The answer must also account for instances where arrests were quick, or at least appeared to be. 2 examples of this are the cases of Ampleforth and Parsons. With no other information on the circumstances of their arrests, both seem to have been seized quite quickly. Ampleforth's crime was leaving the word God in a Kipling poem, given there was no other appropriate rhyme for rod. Parsons' crime was more offensive to the ears of the Fort Police. The generally orthodox-seeming outer party member was caught shouting, "Down with Big Brother," in his sleep. Assuming these were their first offences, both were apprehended quite quickly. Of course, these acts may have been the acts on which the Fort Police decided to act, much like Winston oversleeping in his room was his act that they could not ignore. On a sliding scale, however, Winston's act is by far the worst. Ampleforth's is very tame. Parsons' is certainly offensive, and Winston's, along with his affair with a fellow outer party member, was beyond the pale. Assuming the other 2 were caught and exposed with their acts, this does seem strange then on face value. However, the answer as to why Winston was left alone for years may ironically be because he was an extreme case of thought crime. One commonly misunderstood thing about the party and the Fort Police is that they are simply in the business of stamping out thought crime as quickly and efficiently as possible. While it's true the party does want to stamp out all resistance, however powerless it is, it's also true that the party, particularly the inner party, exists and maintains the structure of society precisely for the end of exercising said power. O'Brien quite genuinely explains this to Winston during his interrogation. Winston, of course, had long pondered why the party in society exists the way it does. He had grasped how it does, and O'Brien understood Winston's gap of knowledge. As O'Brien explains, the reason for power is to exercise said power, that is to revel in the suffering of the heretic. Power is not a means, but an end. Hence O'Brien's famous words that one does not establish a dictatorship to safeguard a revolution, but that one makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. O'Brien freely admits that, quote, "We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power. Not wealth or luxury or long life or happiness, only in power, pure power. Power has to be collective for it to be sustainable in the long term, but the act itself is also very rigidly defined. Quote, power is power over human beings, over the body, but, above all, over the mind." When O'Brien talks of tearing human minds apart and reshaping them into forms of his own choosing, that is an exercise of power. Yet what does this all have to do with the length of delay before Winston's arrest? Well, O'Brien explains this later on. If such a reality exists, then necessarily there is a requirement for heresy. The inner party, in a warped way, likely allow at least a few of the more egregious thought criminals to compound their crimes for long periods, precisely to enhance their own experience of power. This process may be something akin to experienced gamers playing a particular game on the hardest setting to get a greater challenge and thus sense of satisfaction for completing the game. For inexperienced gamers, the easy or Parsons setting may be enough to satisfy their boredom. However, for veteran players, only a Winston setting will do. I'm quite confident that O'Brien is genuine in his belief about the party's control. They may not be omnipotent, but they're not a million miles away from it either. Any serious threats to the party are always detected and monitored, but if all are simply crushed at the moment of detection or soon after, then there is no point of the structure of control to begin with. For this reason, O'Brien confirms, quote, "The heretic, the enemy of society, will always be there, so that he can be defeated and humiliated over again. Everything that you have undergone since you have been in our hands, all that will continue, and worse. The espionage, the betrayals, the arrests, the tortures, the executions, the disappearances will never cease. Goldstein and his heresies will live forever. Every day, at every moment, they will be defeated, discredited, ridiculed, spat upon, and yet they will always survive. This drama that I have played out with you during 7 years will be played out over and over again, generation after generation, always in subtler forms. Always we shall have the heretic here at our mercy, screaming with pain, broken up, contemptible, and in the end, utterly penitent, saved from himself, and crawling to our feet of his own accord. That is the world that we are preparing, Winston, a world of victory after victory, triumph after triumph after triumph, an endless pressing upon the nerve of power. To summarise then, men and women like Winston and Julia are not to be totally eradicated, but if anything, encouraged in a warped way, contained and made harmless, but still, at least in some cases, heretics and thought criminals are to be tolerated as the inner party canvas on which to exercise the power they so crave and jealously protect. Winston's long spell under the gaze of the thought police makes perfect sense in this context. O'Brien and others like him simply view it as a delightful game. Deeper than that, the very purpose of their existence and the very structure of society. Ironically then, the existence of Winston and thought criminals like him are as necessary for the rulers of Oceania as the thought police itself. This also ties in with what Winston himself instinctively understands after he is released. He knows the thought police no longer care about him following his time with them, as he had already been utterly defeated. He even thinks that he and Julia could have had sex in public, and it would likely have not been cared about. This is because both are completed games, to continue with our computer games analogy of earlier on. After Room 101, Winston loved Big Brother, and there was no longer any resistance against which O'Brien or any other inner party member could exercise their power, hence his irrelevance to the thought police. So that was why Winston was allowed to remain free for so long after his exposure. Hello brothers and sisters, and today we consider the meaning of one of the more memorable phrases from George Orwell's 1984. Could the phrase be a useful link between events that may reveal a creepy, early encounter involving Winston and O'Brien? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we'll consider the deeper meaning of this phrase, and another darker possibility based on the lore. The first quote we shall consider is the following. Quote, "Years ago, how long was it? 7 years it must be? He had dreamed he was walking through a pitch-dark room, and someone sitting to one side of him had said as he passed, 'We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness.'" What's interesting at this early stage is that Winston doesn't really grasp the phrase's meaning, though he was certain that the prediction would somehow come true. Vaguely too, Winston is unsure whether he had seen O'Brien for the first time before or after having the dream. This is important, as if he had not, then his identification of O'Brien as the voice that uttered the phrase would be odd. It would have to be false, as how could he dream of a man's voice who he had yet to see or hear? We'll get back to that though. Assuming Winston had seen O'Brien around about the time before he had had his dream, and had been quite impressed by him, as we know he would remain up into the plot of the novel itself, this makes perfect sense. Even if his recollection is a false memory of sorts, the phrasing is a bit random to have come from nowhere, especially when later on in his meeting with O'Brien seems unsurprised at the phrase when Winston suggests it. Quote, "There are a couple of minutes before you need go," said O'Brien. "We shall meet again, if we do meet again." Winston looked up at him. "In the place where there is no darkness?" he said hesitantly. O'Brien nodded without appearance of surprise. "In the place where there is no darkness," he said, as though he had recognized the allusion. "This section of Part 2, Chapter 8 is essential to understand if the theory I am about to imminently suggest is to be entertained. Namely, O'Brien is perfectly aware of what the phrase really means, and so are we as readers. We know that it refers to the windowless and perpetually lit interior of the dreaded Ministry of Love, something Winston later realizes too. A side issue here then is why Winston did not have alarm bells ringing in his ears at O'Brien's seemingly blatant, almost cocky admission of his understanding of the phrase here. From what we know, only Winston knows this phrase, and even then from a vague and unexplained source. He simply heard it in a dream and perhaps constructed a false memory of it with O'Brien's voice. This seems strange to me. We know that the phrase is probably not common, like the bone-chilling Room 101, as Winston struggles to understand its meaning from the opening of the novel. In Chapter 2 of Part 1, it's mysterious, and given he associates it with O'Brien, who at this stage Winston hopes could be a secret thought criminal, he later interprets the phrase as a source of hope, again linking it to O'Brien. Quote, "The place where there is no darkness was the imagined future, which one would never see, but which, by foreknowledge, one could mystically share in." This thought, in Part 1, Chapter 8, is also important for two reasons, as, firstly, it again links with the meeting with O'Brien, which I shall explain presently, but also as Winston was writing in his diary at the time, or at the very least is implied to be. It specifically states a couple of paragraphs back, quote, "He opened the diary. It was important to write something down." The question is then, did Winston transfer this particular thought, our quote, into his diary? Because if he did, then this attachment to the phrase and his present association of a better future with it would then be known to the thought police and O'Brien, who we later find out had been monitoring Winston closely for 7 years and have been reading his diary too. Indeed, Winston later reveals that even the whitish speck of dust he placed on the cover to help him detect if anybody had read it had been carefully replaced to avoid his suspicions. Zipping back to the meeting scene, we read O'Brien using very similar phrasing to Winston's idea of what the phrase means. Quote, "We are the dead. Our only true life is in the future. We shall take part in it as handfuls of dust and splinters of bone, but how far away that future may be, there is no knowing." To me, this is too on the mark to be pure coincidence. Remember, at this point, from Winston's and our perspective, Winston has only even spoken to O'Brien twice, the present time included. Now he seems to be confirming Winston's idea of a future linked to the phrase we are considering. This is Communist Parade red flags territory, as not only does O'Brien say what Winston wants to hear, but shows no surprise in his use of the phrase. I submit to you then that the reason O'Brien is not surprised is that he did indeed say the actual phrase that Winston heard in his dream, though I don't think it was a dream, or if it was, the dream was suggested by O'Brien himself before he had even met Winston. How could this be? Well, we know how sensitive telescreens can be. Winston himself relates that they can pick up the sound of a raised heartbeat. We also know for a fact they can be targeted to particular individuals. Winston's is used by the instructress to bark at him for not touching his toes. What if O'Brien had spoken the phrase to Winston through his telescreen? Telescreens, as Winston explains near the opening of the novel, cannot be switched off, though they can be dimmed somewhat. Note too the timing of both the dream and the date at which the Thought Police began to monitor Winston. Winston was told he had been under the gaze of the Thought Police for 7 years. Quote, "He knew now that for 7 years the Thought Police had watched him like a beetle under a magnifying glass." Also, when in the Ministry of Love later on, we even get an eerie parallel to the earlier dream which Winston links directly to it. Quote, and once, Winston could not remember whether it was in drugged sleep or in normal sleep, or even in a moment of wakefulness, a voice murmured in his ear, "Don't worry, Winston, you are in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." He was not sure whether it was O'Brien's voice, but it was the same voice that had said to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness," in that other dream 7 years ago. I think this is a rare instance where we can reasonably dispel Orwell's ambiguity here, as we know Winston associates the phrase and that earlier dream with O'Brien. This, coupled with O'Brien's knowledge of the phrase in the meeting. As we know, he directed Winston's interrogation. Indeed, the latter quote is in the context of Winston musing that O'Brien was many things at that time, including inquisitor, friend and tormentor, and it all does indicate that O'Brien must have also creepily uttered the phrase to Winston whilst in sleep or half-sleep. Perhaps 7 years before, Winston's case had been presented to O'Brien, and he had eagerly taken it up. In another linking phrase, O'Brien also says during the interrogation itself, quote, "This drama that I have played out with you during 7 years will be played out over and over again, generation after generation, always in subtler forms." This drama, the word betrays how O'Brien likely sees the whole affair. It's all a game, an exercise in power that the inner party and himself exists for. It's no surprise then that the opening of this game, this whole drama, should begin with the hunter speaking directly to his prey through his very own telescreen. It all makes sense anyway, O'Brien's unsurprised confirmation of the phrase itself at the meeting, a confirmation that can't be explained in any other way, bar the phrase being a common one, which it can't be, as part of the point of it is that it remained mysterious to Winston until his interrogation. We also had the mirroring of Winston's erroneous interpretation of it as indicative of some brighter future that O'Brien uses. And finally, Orwell seems careful to have the dates align too, and provides an otherwise arbitrary demonstration fairly early on of the telescreen being used to directly communicate with Winston in his home through the instructress. What I think we can say then is that 7 years before his capture, O'Brien directly uttered the phrase to Winston while he slept or was half awake, and that's why he associated it with O'Brien from the first. Going back full circle, remember Winston is unsure whether he saw O'Brien for the first time before or after his dream. Well, now after could be explained, as the answer is no, but he had heard O'Brien before then. If this is all true then, and O'Brien both suggested the phrase and used it as another layer of manipulation over the years he toyed with Winston, what does it all mean as an overall moral for the story? Well, since the novel itself is Orwell's warning about totalitarianism, this subtle form of psychological manipulation is a further demonstration of the horrors of absolute state control, that not only does the party control Winston's body, but was even influencing his thoughts from before the novel had even started. So that was my whole theory behind the place where there is no darkness. But what do you think? Do all the puzzle pieces fit to indicate O'Brien creepily spoke to Winston while he slept 7 years before Chapter 1? Or are there other explanations for his knowledge of the words and his lack of surprise? Central to Winston's journey in this dystopian classic is his dangerous and intense affair with Julia. Yet while often characterised as a love affair, on a deeper reflection of events, were Winston and Julia really in love? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider the pros and cons of this issue. The answer may actually be more complex than some suspect. Firstly, let's consider the very catalyst of the affair itself. The literal love note passed to Winston is unambiguous. The words, "I love you," stunning Winston from initial dislike of Julia to secret longing to meet her. However, just because these words are clear does not mean Julia necessarily meant for them to be taken literally. As discussed in a previous video, such traceable messages are highly risky and dangerous in the heavily monitored society of Oceania. with every person a possible spy or grass, and every building, and even an individual's very home, teeming with telescreens and microphones, such a physical message could easily be spotted, and through the handwriting traced to a culprit. Any message needs to be short, unambiguous, and to the point. Those 3 words achieved this. Rather than words like, "meet me at so-and-so," she used those words to make her intention as clear as possible. A message like, "meet me at so-and-so," could be interpreted as a trap or threat. The word love, rather than like, is also more definitive. It also seems appropriate to the context. Any unsanctioned contact between a male and a female party member, especially an intimate relationship, was highly forbidden. So going to the extreme, that is, "I love you," rather than the more lukewarm "I like you," is perfectly natural. The overarching point then is that the word was used almost certainly functionally, which worked too. Julia's note perfectly conveyed her intentions, Winston scarcely doubting her after receiving it. That the two had never properly met before also adds weight to our deliberations here. At least at this stage, it's rather silly to believe that either felt any genuine affection towards the other, let alone love. Indeed, we know how Winston felt towards Julia, at least prior to their meetings, as he clearly expresses his emotions. Winston is simultaneously both attracted to her and disgusted by her too. Winston's attraction is complex and does evolve throughout his time with her. Prior to the note, his attraction is physical, but also political. At the 2 minutes hate, he fantasizes about forcing himself on her, this dark thought mixed with the more violent one of killing her at the moment of climax. This may seem random at first, but actually serves to express both his raw physical desire for her, but also his hatred of the party, as well as the political world and orthodoxy, which he also equates with her sort. Winston certainly believes that Julia is likely a typically bigoted fanatic of the party, and so to be avoided. In addition to his thoughts about Julia at the 2 minutes hate, Winston also has an erotic dream of Julia stripping naked, though this act also links to his other politically tinged attraction to her too. Indeed, this vision seems to foreshadow this dimension of his attraction. The actual quote is as follows, quote, "The girl with dark hair was coming towards him across the field. With what seemed a single movement, she tore off her clothes and flung them disdainfully aside. Her body was white and smooth, but it aroused no desire in him. Indeed, he barely looked at it. What overwhelmed him in that instant was admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes aside. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a single splendid movement of the arm." What's interesting with this particular quote is the political side to his attraction to her, though it may be more accurate still to pinpoint the implied act of an affair, or its implication here that particularly attracts him in that moment. Winston even admits Julia's naked body did not arouse him at that point, but the gesture itself particularly fascinated him. Given the aforementioned taboo on affairs between party members and Winston's hatred of Big Brother and the party, it's no wonder he attaches such significance to the gesture itself in which Julia removes her attire in his dream. This sentiment ties to the later scene already analysed in 1984 Lore's previous video, Sex as Rebellion. Here Winston is pleased that Julia has had scores of intimate encounters, perhaps many partners. This goes beyond the act itself. It's the undermining of the party itself that fills Winston with hope and excitement. That many party men had committed adultery was evidence the system was not perfect. My point is, at this stage in their relationship, it's difficult to argue Winston loved Julia in any literal sense. If he did develop feelings for her, then it was later in their affair, as we shall soon see. Before we do, it's worth considering, more properly speculating really, how Julia felt at the time prior to their meeting too. Again, just thinking about this with some common sense, it's hard to believe Julia loved Winston, though there was obviously at least an attraction there. Julia, after all, initiated contact with the note to begin with, though if we read between the lines, it's likely they have had contact and other subtle signs of being mutually attracted to one another before then. Julia's initiation of contact was certainly not baseless. In the Golden Country scene, she explains that she saw something in Winston's face that suggested he was against them and thought she would take a chance. Presumably, she saw potential there for what eventually occurred, a love affair. One thing occasionally asked is why Julia felt attracted to Winston to begin with. I personally think it's quite obvious that, though he's not Airstrip 1's answer to Brad Pitt, Winston's attraction to Julia is for his subtle attitude and personality. She sees something in him that suggests rebellion. From this seed of thought, it's not difficult to imagine her constructing a pleasant image of the man of her dreams, or at least of a man, a dangerous and exciting man she would like to know much better. It didn't escape my notice during the meeting scene that she already knows his name at least, even saying she's probably better at finding things out than he is. She's clearly interested enough in him to be digging about for these details anyway, though finding out his name may seem trivial. Even such basic information about people you don't know is likely difficult to obtain given the nature of the society she lives in. Julia's raw attraction, then, seems just as intent as Winston's at this point. A key passage in support of this early lust over true love interpretation is Winston's own view on the first meeting, in which he described it more as an act of the will. The love-making, as he frequently describes it, was more of a given at that moment, given the mutual physical attraction. At the same time, however, Winston himself notes how his attitude had shifted, and it's this long but key quote that truly shows the change to love, at least in Winston. Quote, "During the month that he had known her, the nature of his desire for her had changed. At the beginning there had been little true sensuality in it. Their first love-making had been simply an act of the will, but after the second time, it was different. The smell of her hair, the taste of her mouth, the feeling of her skin seemed to have got inside him, or into the air all around him. She had become a physical necessity. When she said that she could not come, he had the feeling that she was cheating him. But just at this moment, the crowd pressed them together, and their hands accidentally met. She gave the tips of his fingers a quick squeeze that seemed to invite not desire, but affection. It struck him that when one lived with a woman, this particular disappointment must be a normal, recurring event, and a deep tenderness, such as he had not felt for her before, suddenly took hold of him. Winston furthermore fantasizes about the pair being married and living in a world similar to ours, in which such a relationship was just normal. He daydreams of buying things for the household and discussing trivialities. Clearly at this stage, I think we can say with some certainty that the relationship has matured, even if it's still young. Julia's reassuring finger squeeze expresses something more than just a carnal arrangement somehow, and Winston's own words are evidence enough of his own feelings beyond just the lovemaking they have. A scene later on that really seals the deal for me, at least on Winston's end, is in Part 2, Chapter 7. Quote, "The one thing that matters is that we shouldn't betray one another, although even that can't make the slightest difference. If you mean confessing," she said, "we shall do that right enough. Everybody always confesses. You can't help it. They torture you. I don't mean confessing. Confession is not betrayal. What you say or do doesn't matter. Only feelings matter. If they could make me stop loving you, that would be the real betrayal." Unlike the use of the word at the very beginning of their relationship, it's difficult to argue that love here is not used in the literal sense. Here we are 3 chapters on from the crowd scene with the affectionate squeeze of Winston's fingers. What's more, we know this feeling is genuine, as it forms the last inner resistance Winston holds on to until his final submission in Room 101, and is therefore an important core of his character at this point. Earlier in the novel, we see Winston muse on the importance of feelings, especially love itself, pondering the unconditional maternal love of his mother for him, which was also mirrored in the Jewish woman and her son, who were blown up in the war film he watched. For Winston, such feelings are yet another horror inflicted by the inhuman world he lives in, another indignity demanded by the party, that such natural feelings had to be relearned by people like him. Indeed, Winston regretfully laments on how as a child he had been too selfish and hungry to love his mother back, that in the movie theatre he had belittled the prole woman's reaction to the explosion, and that he had also coldly kicked aside the severed hand during the rocket bomb attack. Proles, he thought, were still human beings, whereas party members were not. Feelings are all important to him, as they are all that separate him from the party NPCs. Even his love for Julia, then, is thus a political act of a sort. Winston later convinced, as we saw in the last passage, that at least that could not be taken from him. That one betrayal was one beyond the party's power to provoke. Unfortunately, as we all know, this turns out not to be true. By this point then, it's certain that Winston does indeed love Julia, or up until his fateful time in room 101 anyway. So, what about Julia? We saw the affectionate squeeze of the fingers in the scene before last, but note that she did not actually verbally reciprocate Winston's declaration of love in chapter 7. Well, as you may have guessed, I believe Julia's confirmation of her own feelings comes a little later in the meeting with O'Brien. A quick point is to emphasise the fact that Julia even follows Winston to meet O'Brien is in itself a strong indication of their bond at this point, since Julia herself was not invited to O'Brien's flat. I'm confident that Julia before Winston would not have dreamed of risking such a move, even perhaps for a former lover, yet there she was following Winston to the home of an inner party member, on little more than a flash of the eyes and Winston's secret hopes. At that meeting, of course, we see Winston speaking for both of them, and Julia mostly remains silent. There may be other reasons for this on the part of Orwell, but I believe one reason she does remain so quiet throughout the meeting was to emphasise what happened when O'Brien suggested that they may have to permanently split. Her no seems rather clear to me. Interestingly, Winston is somewhat speechless. For a few seconds, his lips and tongue fumbling on different words before settling on the mirroring of Julia's no. What exactly Winston may have considered answering with before his own no is up for debate, but he did finally reject this too. My theory on this curious reaction from Winston is that it was not so much hesitance as shock, that is, pleasant surprise. I could be wrong, but Winston may simply have been genuinely taken aback by Julia's indirect expression of love, and so it took him a few seconds to recover. Another obvious interpretation of his hesitance is that he was simply going to assent to this too, without much thought. A very minor spoiler for the novel Julia. Please click ahead to avoid this. In Newman's novel, Julia interprets this as though Winston was about to say yes to that too, and that Winston was a little annoyed, but begrudgingly said no too. As with many things with Newman's novel, however, I don't quite buy this interpretation of events. Orwell is not that specific on exactly what other words Winston was trying to say. For all we know, it could have been a variation of the negative, such as never or something similar. What we can take away from this scene, at least in relation to our interest today, is that Julia was not willing to part with Winston, and on that point alone she objected, which is no small thing when O'Brien reels off all the other things they may be expected to do, such as forgery, sabotage, betraying their country, and murder, to name some. A final observation that the two really were in love is the final conversation we see them have after their time in the Ministry of Love. We delve more into this scene in the video Did Julia Face Room 101, so it suffices for us to note here that Julia indeed, like Winston, had to face her worst fear, and that in doing so, it strongly hinted that it was Winston who was her only person in the world whom she could swap with, as she explains in a roundabout way how she had betrayed him, in the very sense Winston had wanted to not betray her, as we saw previously. Such a betrayal necessitates her love for Winston, just as Winston's betrayal of Julia required him to love her in return. In the end, I think that the whole question of if the two could ever really have been in love is, with respect to the skeptical ones out there, a little daft. For me, the love between them is essential to highlighting the real horror of Orwell's dystopian world. How even something as natural, pure, and seemingly inviolate as a man and woman's love for one another can be destroyed, replaced with a love forged from pain and suffering, a love for Big Brother and the party. Without this genuine love between them, this key part of the story doesn't really work, as both Julia, and more importantly, as we experience events through his eyes, Winston's horrific transformation and corruption would not mean as much, and there would have been no true betrayals in the sense Winston meant it, or any obstacle for O'Brien and the party to overcome to begin with. On this issue at least, I'm as certain as I can be that Winston and Julia were genuinely in love, even if their time together was only a short one. But what do you think? Were Winston and Julia truly in love? Was the nature of their relationship always just physical and nothing more? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we take a brief look at the symbolism surrounding, of all things, razor blades in the novel. A quick warning before I continue that my thoughts today cover a dark area that I can't directly name without YouTube condemning this video to the memory hole. So if you've been affected by this issue, or are otherwise sensitive to it, then fair warning, I will discuss self-deletion as it's relevant to the subject today. So, though seemingly arbitrary as an item that party members just so happen to lack at that particular time, I think the razor blade has a deeper significance as a symbol within the book. I believe the item represents free will, given its intended use as a means of self-deletion. Though a rather dark take, nevertheless as we read the book we can see this is obvious. In Part 1, Chapter 5, the canteen scene is important in establishing this connection between the object and free will. Winston explains that many items are routinely in short supply, for example shoelaces that require party members to venture into the proletarian areas to buy them on the black market. Interestingly, this is a consequence of the party's own deliberate policy of creating scarcity and poverty through the Ministry of Plenty. By underproducing or over-consuming produced goods, particularly within the military sphere, the party creates the economic atmosphere, that is, crushing poverty, that it feels is necessary to help maintain the hierarchical system and hence its own power. That items are scarce at all is a symptom of the ingsoc economy. However, the particular connections that make razor blades specifically a symbol of freedom are Winston himself and its use as a tool to take the ultimate decision in defiance of the party. Though we can theorise that other characters do have their own minds and heretical thoughts too, we know for a fact that Winston at least does, as well as Julia too later on. Winston, unlike his lover from our perspective, is a constant throughout the novel, at least until the closing chapters, as an individual that is internally in defiance of the party. In Part 1, Chapter 5, we significantly have Winston contrasted with both Syme and Parsons, who both, at least superficially at this stage, are loyal, right-thinking party members. The last point can be endlessly debated. Syme's exact crime and fate is only speculated on by Winston. That he was vaporized, if indeed he even was, does not logically mean Syme was a thought criminal. Indeed, various possibilities exist for him, including escape and self-deletion, as well as the popular theory that he simply vanished to take up a new personality and position within the ranks of the inner party. Parsons, though allegedly shouting "down with Big Brother" in his sleep, was hardly an extreme thought criminal, with many fans doubting he was even one at all. His sycophantic attitude in the cell with Winston suggests that there was little wrong with him from an orthodox perspective. Both Syme and Parsons, therefore, can reasonably be described as orthodox, that is, unfree party members, in contrast to Winston. That Winston possesses razor blades then, and this item specifically, rather than say shoelaces or soap or any of a million other non-lethal things, is, I believe, no accident. Winston still has a measure of freedom in contrast to the fanatically orthodox Syme and the pathetically supplicating Parsons, which is why he has them and they don't. Orwell makes a point of these two characters asking Winston if he had razor blades, to which he quickly answers guiltily in the negative. On the act of self-deletion itself, unaliving oneself is the ultimate snub to party power, given its near total control over society. With firearms unavailable, using a razor blade was one of the quicker, if messy, methods by which a party member could end things. Since they were also an item the party reasonably had to allow access to for hygiene purposes, they were a tolerable risk too. I say risk as we know from O'Brien's own words in Part 3 that the party finds it intolerable for any free mind to exist. He explains to Winston that once he is cured of his own insanity, that he will in time be destroyed. Though dark then, unaliving oneself is the ultimate, unanswerable act of free will against the party in this world, the victim forever out of reach. Indeed, Winston confirms as much, describing his own longed-for scenario in Part 3, Chapter 4, in which the party shoots him as his own mind refills with hatred. With that act, he hoped, they would have blown apart their own perfection, with no means to retrieve and cure him once again. That the razor blade is linked to self-deletion is heavily supported in the lore. Winston does explain that many disappearances are in fact self-deletions. Indeed, this is confirmed by at least one case, that of Julia's first lover, who saw to his own demise rather than fall into the hands of the Fort Police. O'Brien, playing his role as a Brotherhood member, states in the meeting scene that sometimes they try to smuggle a razor blade into the Ministry of Love for use by a captured member. This is one of the few thoughts that dominates Winston's mind in the first hours and days of his incarceration, that he could seize a blade and end it all before the guards could intervene. Interestingly, given the theory here, Winston for some reason thinks that Ampleforth may be the bearer of a razor blade. Firstly, I find this a bit odd, given that even if this is true, I assume that it would be for both their uses, as if he did possess it with the intent of giving it to Winston, then it surely follows he too is a Brotherhood member, and, given his own situation, he too would have need of it. Are we to believe then that both men, in just a few seconds, could use the object to self-delete before the guards could rush in to stop one or both of them? A second interesting implication, assumed by the first point, is that Winston at least suspects, or is open to the possibility, that the bumbling, hairy-eared poet, as he at one time calls him, could not only be a thought criminal, but a full-blown Brotherhood member too. This too is odd. There's no indication beforehand that Ampleforth has heretical tendencies. So, where is Winston's thought process coming from here? Of course, given his desperate situation, including his rising thirst and hunger, rational thinking would not be natural to him in this context. Whatever the case, Ampleforth too does not possess a razor blade. Neither does he seem particularly interested in much else other than his own predicament. Like Parsons, in my opinion, his crime was very tame, if he's indeed correct about it. He could not find an appropriate rhyme for rod, other than God, and so left the offending word in a Kipling poem. By the opening of Part 3 then, Winston himself no longer has access to his razor blades. This relatively quick, if gruesome method of self-deletion is now totally lost to him, and he must now face the Fort Police and months of agony within the Ministry of Love. While in the very earliest chapters, Winston still very much has his so-called inner mind intact, by Chapter 4 of Part 3, even this is mostly compromised, with O'Brien commenting that, intellectually, there was little wrong with him. With his final breaking in Room 101, his last emotional barrier to the full destruction of any free will he had was gone.
In Michael Radford's 1984 adaptation of George Orwell's 1984, we see a curious couple of scenes in which, after he's curing by O'Brien and the Fort Police, Winston Smith is seen making a public confession on the telescreens. However, is this consistent with the intentions and spirit of the novel? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we dissect a particular possible inconsistency in Radford's otherwise great adaptation of the novel. So what exactly is this inconsistency? Well, it centers around the concept of vaporization. Vaporization, for those who don't recall, is the act of completely removing a person from history, the total annihilation of the individual from all memory, records, and living brains. Winston himself is told during his interrogation that this is his ultimate fate. Indeed, even at this time, O'Brien somewhat paradoxically asserts that Winston already does not exist. Vaporization is the ultimate punishment for the individual thought criminal, and also, crucially, a means of party control. By erasing the dissident from all records and severely punishing any mention of the condemned man or woman, the party also surgically removes a focus of dissent from the populace, at least in theory. Vaporization, then, is a key concept and fate in the world, and a particularly horrific demonstration of just how far a totalitarian government like the party could be willing to go to control its host population and maintain its own power. So if vaporization, and particularly Winston's own, is such an important part of Orwell's novel, how does the film undermine this? Well, as we shall see, this is arguable, but given Winston is already an unperson prior to his release from custody, having his public confession broadcasted on the telescreens is inconsistent for a couple of reasons. In the book, Winston makes it clear that such public confessions were rare. Quote, "It was unusual for political offenders to be put on trial or even publicly denounced. The great purges involving thousands of people, with public trials of traitors and thought criminals who made abject confession of their crimes and were afterwards executed, were special showpieces, not occurring oftener than once in a couple of years. I suspect that they were also at his present usually reserved for particularly prominent individuals, though even Comrade Withers was not forced to give a public confession, despite his status as a prominent inner party member and possible rival of Big Brother. If Withers didn't publicly confess, a man in charge of the shadowy FFCC, then why would Winston Smith? Winston is only important to us as the novel's everyman protagonist, and though he certainly has his own quirks and personality, he doesn't strike me as particularly threatening or important in his world. What's more, Winston was already an unperson at the time his confession was aired in the novel, at least according to O'Brien. In the Ministry of Love, O'Brien directly implies this when Winston presses him on whether or not Big Brother really exists in the way he exists, by simply dismissively responding that Winston does not exist. A relevant digression here is that the novel itself may be internally inconsistent here, given that although Winston is supposedly an unperson already during his interrogation, he is still released after Room 101 and allowed to interact with the population. We see him directly interact with the waiter and a reformed Julia, while Winston himself informs us that he still works and even interacts with similar individuals to himself in a committee. This indicates that perhaps Winston is not yet truly an unperson, which contradicts O'Brien's earlier implication. However, even if we accept this still doesn't explain why Winston in particular would merit having a public confession, given his own relatively lowly status and unimportance. Another element to all this to consider is doublethink, that is, the process of holding two contradictory thoughts in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both. Through doublethink, it's certainly possible for O'Brien, and, in theory, all other party members to both erase their memories of Winston, while also acknowledging his existence when needed. Since reality is what the party dictates it is, in this twisted world, it's perfectly possible for Winston's brief diminished existence after his ordeal in the Ministry of Love to be tolerated before his final obliteration from the stream of history. Perhaps then, through doublethink, O'Brien was sincere in his assertion, while even Winston's status as an unperson can be both accepted and denied simultaneously, depending on the needs of the moment. Strictly speaking then, perhaps Radford's scenes of Winston's confession are not so damning after all. The party could have decided for whatever reason that despite his unimportance, Winston's confession could be useful while following this immediate need, Winston's unpersonhood could be a reinstated fact. Of course, Radford's depiction of Winston's confession is, when it comes down to it, not canon. However, it is perhaps consistent with the spirit of the novel, and is feasible given what we know. However, another interesting addition within the film furthermore calls into question Winston's ultimate status as an unperson. This is seemingly a throwaway line uttered by O'Brien after the "they got you too" moment. After receiving the blow from the guard, O'Brien says that the intimate photos taken of both Winston and Julia would be recycled for proletarian use. This too would seem to suggest that Winston in some fashion could not be fully vaporized then, as naughty images of him and his lover would live on perhaps for many years in various forms, as part of the prole feed of the party. Related to this, I do find the whole replacing of unpersons in Minitrue intriguing too. In a time before AI, we can assume that when replacing an individual in records with an entirely fictitious character, such a character still requires a face. In the film and novel, Winston uses a random picture to depict Comrade Ogilvy, an entirely fictional man who replaces Comrade Withers, an unperson. However, this prompts the question, where did Ogilvy's face come from? One obvious answer is that, ironically enough, Ogilvy may be assigned the face of an unperson. Perhaps similarly in Winston's case, his post-mortem career as an oceanic adult literature star may have endured, albeit under a fictitious name and persona. So, are these two additions to Radford's adaptation truly inconsistencies? Strictly speaking, they are not canon, as they do not appear in the book. However, as we have seen through the process of doublethink and post-mortem manipulation of the records, Winston's confession and his visual existence are not necessarily outright contradictions of the concept of vaporization. As we have seen, even if Winston's post-Room 101 existence was temporarily tolerated and his public confession broadcast, these facts could both easily be useful to the party at one moment of time, and then quite easily through doublethink and sheer fear be once more denied once Winston's time for execution came. Even Winston's post-mortem life as a series of pictures in the naughty pages of the prole feed would not pose a significant problem. The pictures would no longer depict Winston and Julia, but totally different people, characters in a seedy story with the faces of the dead. The life, thoughts and influence of Winston would still be obliterated, along with the true context of those images, but the mask of the man would eerily live on, along with that of his lover. So what do you think? Does Winston's public confession and O'Brien's recycling of the intimate images of him and Julia contradict the idea of vaporization? Can anybody truly be said to be vaporized? Write your thoughts in the comments section, and remember, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past.